Okay, hello everyone. It is 4 o'clock, so we'll make a start. Thank you for all joining me this afternoon. As with last week, I've muted you all, but if you do have any questions or comments as we go through, please do use the chat function, and my colleague Mike is on hand to interrupt me if there's any urgent questions, but also I'll pause throughout for opportunities for questions and comments as well. So yeah, obviously a lot's happened since I last spoke to you. We now have the Ofqual consultation. So what I'm going to go through is just kind of some of the headlines, and then if you want to delve into any of those issues more deeply, please do. What I will say at the start, just to preempt any questions, is at this time next week, so at 4 p.m. on the 30th of April, SSAT will be holding a similar Zoom chat, particularly around leading this process of summer of teacher assessment and ranking, and that will be with myself and Dylan William. And so I'm pleased to invite particularly sort of heads of department, senior members of the team who are involved in that process to the Zoom chat next week, which will be really focused on how you go about leading that from a leadership perspective. So I'm going to start off and I'm going to share a PowerPoint slide with you all, which hopefully you can see. So sort of starting off, thinking about some of the speculation that's been in the press around school reopenings. I mean, I think, you know, we don't know when schools are going to reopen. I think they're certainly not going to reopen in May, and I think that's fairly clear. Jeff Barton at Ofqual this week has suggested the 1st of June could be a starting point for it, but we'll wait and see. The government has set out 5 criteria that must be met if schools are to be reopened. And I think it's bearing in mind, you know, when you're talking to parents, talking to students about when school might be reopened, the government has said there are 5 criteria that must be met. We must make sure that the NHS is protected and will not be overrun. Secondly, that there are falling death rates from COVID-19. Equally, there are falling infection rates from COVID-19. That we have adequate, take from that what you want, but we have adequate testing in the UK and adequate PPE, personal protection equipment. Again, take that for what you want. And that we are confident that a second peak is able to be avoided. So again, until those 5 criteria are met, the government has said schools won't reopen. I think also when we talk about schools reopening, we're not talking about every student in every year group returning. We're really talking, I think, about partial reopenings. And again, I think that's probably an important message to send out to parents at this point, that when the media might say school reopenings, we don't quite mean that in the way they might interpret it. Gavin Williamson also said at the weekend that there are no plans at the moment for summer openings of schools, either to catch up on time that has been lost, or as it was over the Easter break, for the children of key workers and vulnerable students, assuming that, you know, hopefully the crisis has moved on somewhat by that point. So moving on, if okay. So the DfE have also released some guidance to schools around workload and furloughing. Obviously, furloughing hasn't really touched the education sector in a big way yet. What the DfE has said is they do not expect most state schools to be furloughing staff. If you're paying staff from salaries paid for by the DSG, by the main grant, from government funding, you shouldn't be furloughing staff, because you're getting the same amount of money this year, regardless of school openings or closures. The exception is if you as a school have private income streams, for example, from catering facilities, from letting your site out, from sports facilities, and you have staff that are paid directly from that private income, not from the DfE income, and because of COVID-19, they're no longer able to work, in that case, you are allowed to furlough. So if you do have those sort of private income streams, that is an option to you. And I know, you know, we do have a couple of private school members in SSAT, and private schools can furlough staff, again, if that's necessary in terms of jobs. So moving on, I apologise, it's very, very slow PowerPoint. So moving on to disadvantaged students, particularly the news at the weekend around disadvantaged year 10s, and Sean has already mentioned the fiasco over free school meal vouchers. So the laptop scheme for disadvantaged year 10s was launched on Sunday. A reminder that individual schools can't apply for that scheme. It has to be done through either your council, your LA, or the trust, and they have to submit a business proposal to the DfE. In the announcement on Sunday, we were told it was due to open yesterday, on Wednesday the 22nd. That wasn't the case. They weren't ready for it. There was no way of submitting the business proposals, and all of the references to yesterday being the start date were removed from the government website. So again, we're seeing another delay, as to the free school meal vouchers, around this issue of laptops. Again, if families are asking you about this, once this year is over, once schools return, once schools return properly with all students back in school, the computers will not be kept by the students, but will go to the school or the academy at which they're at. So it's not something that schools are keeping. In terms of free school meal vouchers, Sean's already mentioned again that, you know, it's a real fiasco. What a government minister did say this week is we know there are an additional 1.4 million families that are applying for universal credit, and that universal credit obviously hasn't come through yet. What she said to the Education Select Committee is that schools should start to offer free school meal vouchers, whether you're doing a national scheme, whether you've got a local scheme, whether you are doing in-house catering, to those families without formal evidence. And as the evidence comes in, then use that. But she said there's no reason why schools shouldn't be doing that. The other issue we know and we are raising with the DfE on a sort of daily basis is a lack of clarity, not just about, you know, trying to actually access Edenred and access a voucher scheme, but whether the government's preference is for the voucher scheme or for local schemes. So again, in the Education Select Committee, this minister talked about the fact the voucher scheme is a backup, and it is preferable for schools to use local schemes, including their usual catering service, to provide meals for disadvantaged students. However, at the same time, we know that the current DfE advice around reimbursing schools for additional money they've had to spend because of COVID-19 says they will only refund money given out for free school meal vouchers where the national scheme wasn't available. For example, if you're in a catchment area that just doesn't have any of the participating supermarkets, you know, if you're in a rural catchment area. So there is some discrepancy there between what is the preferred option. Obviously, what we'll be pushing for at SSAT is very much whatever you have done during this extraordinary period, you should be reimbursed if it's beyond the usual amount you would spend on FSM meals. So moving on, the other thing the DfE have talked about this week is about data, and they're really sort of saying that they themselves are not going to collect any data this year that is not essential, and they strongly urge school leaders not to collect any data that's not essential. And they make clear as well that Key Stage 2, Key Stage 4 and Key Stage 5 results for this year, in this extraordinary year, should not be used for performance management in any way. And I know we have a couple of governors and trustees on this chat as well. And again, they've made clear that your results this summer should not be used in head teacher appraisals and performance management. So just something to bear in mind there. So moving on to probably the more significant part of this afternoon, the Ofqual consultation was announced last week. It closes on the 29th of April. I think it's worth, when we're talking to staff and we're talking to governors and trustees and parents, thinking about this as essentially a 5-part process. You've got the teacher assessment grade, which is obviously the part that's been most talked about, where this year, for any students who are entered into the summer exams, their grade will be based on teacher assessments. We'll talk about this more in a moment and next week. Then you have the rank ordering, and again, what I said last week, and many of you have been in touch to say you agree, is that I don't think we should think about that as a process that comes necessarily later, certainly not towards the end of May, but something that is running concurrently with the teacher assessment grades, particularly in those large subjects where you've got a number of students you've got to rank. Then we have the national standardisation. Once you submit your marks, your teacher assessment grades in the first 2 weeks of June. Then you've got the appeals process, which we'll talk about more in a moment, but essentially the key message there is it's very, very supportive of schools, which I think is good. And then you have the autumn series and the new plans for the autumn series as well. So moving on. One of the big things that we were campaigning for before the consultation was the fact that in the initial guidance, as you know, year 10s and below and year 9s were not included in the summer. They are now included. And so the general rule is that any students that you had already entered for this summer series will be included. There is a slight caveat to that there is some allowance for the awarding organisations, the exam boards, to allow schools to submit, or centres to admit late entries for this summer. So it's still done by teacher assessment if there is very good evidence that they were going to put in a late entry for a particular candidate. So, but the general rule is if students are entered this summer, they'll be treated in the same way, regardless if they're in year 11, year 12, year 10, year 9. Of course, the downside of that, for schools that were hoping for that, who operate curriculum that have early entries in year 10 and 9, is that those students' results will not count in the 2021 and 2022 school performance measures. So for the individual students, they will get the grade, but those results won't count for your school performance measures. What we will continue to push for at SSAT is the removal of school performance measures in 2021 and 2022. We think that's the only fair way of doing this. Not only that, but I think it gives the DfE a kind of a real opportunity to look at the impact of not publishing school performance data for a whole 3-year period on teacher recruitment, on retention, on workload. So actually it could be a really significant time to look at that, and 1 year won't just do that. So that's what we're pushing for. And again, thank you for all your comments over the last 2 weeks, but please do keep coming back to me and let me know if that's what you want. So moving on to look at the ranking, as I said, we'll look at this in more detail next week with Dylan. But a few questions have been raised. So if you've got year 12s who are resitting subjects, if you've got year 10 and year 9 who are doing the same subject as year 11, your ranking is for everyone submitted in that subject. So it's not just your year 11s and a separate one for your year 10s and year 12s, it's everyone that you're submitting. So just again, maybe a note to your heads of department now, just to remind them if they've got resitting year 12s, if they've got any year 10s going for early entry, then they need to be thinking that through. Again, we talked about last week, but a really key point is that ranking, you cannot have batched ranking. So you cannot have 2 people at number 1 or 2 people at number 4. You have got to distinguish between them. And of course, this is something that we know is very, very difficult. If we take a subject like maths, which is perhaps more objective to mark, you might well have students, when you're looking at your initial data list, who got exactly the same mark in your mock assessments, in your whatever you call your pre-public examinations in January or in the winter when you did them. You have to find a way to distinguish between those students. There is some speculation that in centres or colleges with very, very large cohorts, they will be able to batch rank, but there's no details about that. And if that does come in, it's likely to be a number around 500, a cohort of 500. So it won't apply to many schools. It's more the colleges. So again, a few things to bear in mind. Particularly think about those subjects and those areas where you're likely to have bunched groupings, where it's going to be really hard to distinguish. So in most subjects, you'll probably have a fairly good grade distribution, but thinking about stuff like the EPQ at Key Stage 5, where we know there is a lot of bunching around the 6, 7, and 8 grade marks. Thinking about that, thinking about the English resits for your Year 12s, and we know there's a lot of bunching around the 3 and 4 mark. And then I think also one of the things to really pay attention to and to get heads of department paying attention to is that issue of the tops and the bottoms of each grade, because they're the ones that are likely to be adjusted by the national standardisation. So yes, the overall rank order is really important, but really, really pay attention to those to those students who are on the tops and bottoms, because they're the ones that might move up or down. Now, in the consultation paper from Ofqual, it talks about bias and the fact that when teachers are assessing, they may be open to both unconscious and conscious bias against students. Things, for example, like we know that traditionally boys tend to perform less well in mock exams and then pull it out in the summer. So all these sorts of things might come into the assessments that teachers are making. What Ofqual has suggested is that they will not change the ranking order based on any adjustment for bias. So what they said is what they could do is they could look at a school's ranking order and say, oh gosh, all the disadvantaged pupils, all the pupils from this ethnicity are always in the bottom quartile of each grade, and they would adjust the ranking accordingly. They are proposing not to do that. So they are saying whatever you submit as a school as a rank, that will not change. So again, I said last week, and I wrote a piece in SSAT, which was released today. I know some of you have been in touch and said you've read it, that actually in some ways I really do think that ranking is more important than the teacher assessment. The teacher assessment may change due to national standardisation. Your ranking won't. So again, just kind of imploring people there not to leave it until the end of the process, but do it concurrently. But there are different models out there. So looking at both appeals and confidentiality, what I will say about this is the appeals, I think, are less good for students this year, and they are better for schools and teachers. And I think Ofqual have done a lot in the paper to really protect schools during this process, which we know is going to be very, very difficult. So appeals must be done by you as schools, by exam centres, on behalf of the candidates. There's no provision for candidates to appeal directly to the exam boards. As a centre, if a student approaches you after they get their results in the summer and says they'd like you to appeal it on their behalf, you should only do that if you feel that the data that you submitted, which is confidential at that point, has been used incorrectly by the exam board. There is no appeal process based on the teacher assessment, the ranking and the rank order, or the national standardization model and formula. So essentially, the only way in which a student can appeal is if they come to you as a centre and you say, actually, looking at what we submitted without telling them what that was, we think the data's been used incorrectly. So again, I think it's trying there to really support teachers to make professional judgments and not give in to bias. With that in mind, it's worth looking at confidentiality in this process. So centres, schools must not, absolutely must not reveal either the teacher assessment or the rank order before the results come out in the summer. Ofqual are saying that if schools do that, it will be considered exam malpractice, and the usual effects of that would apply. So absolutely, teachers must not say that. You should not, after results, and Ofqual has said, in the interest of maintaining integrity for these exams, what they don't want is schools saying, well, actually, we gave you a grade 8, but only got a 7, so schools should not. And I think that's all very positive. That's all about protecting the school and the relationships you have with the families and the communities, and it allows teachers to make those judgments in a professional way without feeling they need to worry about the fact they're teaching Johnny's sister next year and the relationship you have with that family. Or indeed, sort of parent governance, all these sorts of issues you've already raised with us. The bit that's a bit more controversial is that after those results have been published in the summer, at the moment, under data regulation laws, students can request from you their teacher assessment grade and their order in the rank under the current Ofqual guidance. Now, how many students will do that remains to be seen, but in your own context, the families that perhaps are likely to do that. It doesn't change anything. They still won't be able to appeal that process, but legally, they're able to do that. And you must provide that data. So that's the current situation that we're in, where you must not, before the results are released, you should not after, but if you get a request from a student after the results, you must release that data. That is something that we are arguing should not be the case, and that those teacher assessments and rank order should never be in the public domain and should not be subject to the same GDPR and data regulation laws as other pieces of public data about individuals. We feel that would put undue pressure on teachers in certain cases. Again, let us know your thoughts about that. If you agree that that's something we should be pushing for changing that law, if you don't think that's right and you think actually in the interest of transparency, students should be able to request that data, let us know. The other important thing I think is that we need this urgently, because you need to be able to reassure your staff one way or another that yes, either come August, students, if they want to, can request the judgment you gave about them, or no, they'll never be able to. So I think it's not a case of waiting for the exams to happen, for this process to happen. We need to know now. So moving on to standardization. The national standardization, I apologize, my computer's changed that to American spellings. That's not good. But there are 3 key factors in the standardization formula. We still don't have the formula as is. So your school's previous outcomes, what your school has got in previous years, the prior attainment, i.e. Key Stage 2 data for your GCSE cohorts and GCSE data for your A-level cohorts in your school. So essentially, some of you have come to us and said, well, we're not necessarily seeing a huge improvement, but actually we just have a better cohort. If that's reflected in the data, then that will come into the formula. So if you genuinely, you've just got a much, much better year 11 than you had in the last couple of years, then that will be factored into the formula. And of course, the expected national grade distribution, so that these grades carry the same weight and mean the same to universities and employers in the future. What will not be taken into account, and this is the more controversial bit, is the trajectory of your school's outcomes. So one of the things that we explored were schools that were on a cycle of improvement, particularly rapid improvement in David Carter's kind of schema of school improvement. Rapid improvers that were looking forward to a really significant difference this year. That will not be factored in. It will be based on your previous results as a school and the previous attainment of this cohort. What's not quite clear is how that will work for the year 10s and year 9s that are entered. Of course, there's an added complication there, which is that the current year 10s are the first cohort that did the new style SAT back in year 6 in 2016. So there's just that added complication there as well, but we'll see what happens there. And as I've already mentioned, the standardisation will not include, in the current plans, an adjustment for bias. So it won't be that they're moving any particular groups of students up or down that system. Okay. Thinking about the header centre disclaimer, as the header centre, one of the new parts of the consultation that wasn't in the original document is around this disclaimer that you will have to sign, which will be a legal disclaimer saying that the results you are submitting are accurate and authentic, and you'll have to do one of those for each exam board. So not one for each subject, just one for each of the exam boards that you use. And on the most part, that's going to be a relatively easy document to sign, I imagine, that because you're working through this process at the moment, you're thinking how teachers are going to submit reliable teacher assessments. I would give some particular thought, though, to so-called private candidates, particularly if you have ex-students who wanted to resit either A-levels or GCSEs this year. You haven't seen them for many months, you haven't taught them. Do you have the evidence, hand on heart as a head of centre, that a teacher can make a genuine judgment about what they would have achieved had they sat the exams as normal in the summer? Likewise, we've been talking a lot about community language candidates, again, perhaps EAL students who are doing a GCSE in their native tongue, but might not be taught formally at school. The general advice there from the exam board so far has been to delay that and get them to sit it either in the autumn series or in summer 2021 if you have no evidence of what they would have achieved. And of course, there will be a lot of you who may have had students that started at the start of the calendar year this year. You closed down in March. If you do have those new year 11s, year 10s, year 9s who are due to sit exams, you know, are you clear as a header centre when you sign this document, this disclaimer, that your teachers have the evidence to make those judgments? So I think, as I said, when we look at this more in detail next week, we'll be really digging into some of the detail around this and thinking about, okay, well, yes, we know that bias isn't going to be adjusted for in the national standardisation, but given that Ofqual raised it as an issue, how can we look at that at a whole school level and say, actually, does this reflect previous years and what we would expect? And we'll sort of delve into a lot of these issues in much more detail next week. So finally, the autumn series, there's no date specified, and obviously there's all the caveats around whenever it's safe to do so. I guess maybe November, when the year 12 English and maths resits are, might be a sensible time to do it. It might be earlier, we'll wait and see. Again, key kind of change here from the initial paper, or key clarification from the initial paper, that autumn series will only be eligible for students that entered into the summer 2020 series. So they're already entered. So again, you can't put students that you weren't planning to have sit exams in the autumn. What's not clear yet from Ofqual, and one of the things that we are seeking clarification on, is whether those results done under exam conditions in the autumn, if done by year 10s, who will then be year 11, or year 9s, who will then be year 10s, will then count in the performance measures if they go ahead. You can understand that from a kind of campaigning point of view, that's quite difficult. So on the one hand, we're arguing for the performance measures to be abolished in 21 and 22. On the other hand, we're saying, but if they're not, would these count? And again, any thoughts you have about that would be really gratefully received. And just to say, so yes, only those students entered into summer 2020 will count, but the normal November window for the year 12 resits in English and maths only will still apply. So I'll pause there, and Mike, I know we've had various comments in. Are you there, Mike? Hello, Mike. Okay, I can't hear Mike. So what I'm going to do is just have a quick look at these comments if I can. While I try and do that, what I will say is we have a couple of events happening next week at SSAT. So we have an event on interpreting Key Stage 5 data on Tuesday. That is open to anyone, and we've also got one of our curriculum seminars happening remotely on the Wednesday. Colin Logan, our lead on data assessment and inspection, will be leading the Key Stage 5 event on Tuesday, and myself and Colin will be co-running the curriculum seminar on Wednesday. They're both paid for CPD, unfortunately, but if you would like to join those, please do email events@ssatuk.co.uk. And as I said, next week at the same time at 4 p.m. on Thursday, we'll be looking at how, from a leadership perspective, you lead this process of teacher assessment and ranking. That will be with Dylan William as a guest speaker this time next week. If you do have any questions in the meantime or any occur to you, please do either email your relationship manager. If you don't know who they are, email rmteam@ssatuk.co.uk, or please do continue to email me. Thank you to those that have. Mike, do we have...
Hi. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can, yeah.
Sorry, everybody. I think I seem to be muted, but I didn't think I was. So good afternoon. Okay, we've had lots of questions in and comments already. So I'll just whiz through a few and just outline them for you, Tom, and then you can address
great.
them.
I mean, obviously, I'll try and answer now. If we can't, what I'll do is I'll respond formally over the email forums. But yeah, thanks, Mike.
So one of the, when we started, we talked about Jeff Barton talking about schools opening, and someone just clarified that he actually said that the 1st of June was the earliest that schools could open.
Yeah, sorry, just to be clear there. Yeah, so what Jeff said is the 1st of June will be the absolute earliest, and that schools will require, and schools will need to know that now, essentially. So yeah, just thank you for that clarification on ASCL's position. Yeah.
Regarding furloughing staff, somebody has asked, can we have clarity on the payment from invigilators? Is that available?
Yes, there is a section on that. What I'll do is we are working with our legal partners, Wrigley's. I will. I'm not going to pretend to be an employment lawyer, but what I'll do is I'll get a definitive answer from Wrigley's, hopefully tomorrow, and post it on the email forum.
Then we had a question regarding the laptop scheme and how it could work for a standalone academy. Do they need to go via their local authority, or is there another process?
No, if you're a standalone academy, then as the legal entity of the trust, then you can make a business proposal. Yeah.
Okay. Moving on to the data collection section, the question was, can we clarify if Ofqual will be sharing baseline data for KS2 and KS4 to indicate the context of the year groups that are currently in each cohort?
Oh, yeah, that's fine. I'll need to have a look at that. I'll have a chat with Colin and circulate that to the email forums. Yeah.
Okay. Moving on to the Ofqual consultation, the results. Will Year 12 results count in performance tables?
So just to clarify, yes, the Year 12 results, if they are doing early entry A-level, good question. I don't actually know. Again, I will try and find the answer to that and get it round ASAP. Yeah. My gut feeling is probably not, because I think they would apply the same methodology to early entries in Key Stage 4 as they will in Key Stage 5, but I'll seek clarification on that. Yeah.
A number of questions regarding BTECs, CTECs, entry-level functional skills qualifications. Is there any information on those that's available?
No, nothing formal yet. I've had a chat with Pearson around BTEC this week. They I think, are not clear what they're doing yet, but again, it's something that we are really kind of really on. Yeah.
Okay, then this question's around late entries. So this particular school's got some genuine reasons for there being a small number of late entries. They're asking when they will be able to push for grades for these students. Presumably they don't have to wait until after the grades are released.
To publish the grades, did you say, Mike? Sorry.
When can they push for the grades for these students?
Oh, right. Okay. So if I'm interpreting the question correctly, there will be an opportunity, as I said, in the Ofqual guidance for individual requests to exam boards to do late entries. Oh, sorry, Mike. Did you say early entries or late entries? Sorry,
late entry. Late.
Yeah. So then it will be at the discretion of the exam boards. Again, I'll look at that question in more detail after, and if there's anything to share it on the email forums.
Okay. Regarding the appeals and confidentiality, just another note that some of the suggestions that you've been outlining, they're assuming that they wouldn't be agreed until the consultation closes next week.
Yes. Yeah. Oh, yeah. I think absolutely. We won't have anything until the 29th of April on that, and
Okay.
even then, it would take time to bring that into law. The point is, I think we at least need it mid-May, so that when the window opens at the end of May for assessment, we know what we're submitting in, basically. Yeah.
Okay, then moving on to the standardisation section, the question is, what about where schools have put significant interventions in place, or there's been significant changes to the school's senior leadership team?
No, that won't be taken into account. And at the moment, under the current consultation, there is no way of appealing that directly. As I said last week, the devil is in the detail. It will depend on the weighting that is given to schools' prior results. Again, some will delve into in more detail next week, but Ofqual's own analysis suggests that obviously this has never been done before in recent years, but when you look at stuff like teacher assessment, teacher predictions of final grade for university entries versus actual grade, and other studies that have been done in the UK, the general, what Ofqual conclude is that around 50% of entries will be accurate, around a third will be too lenient and too high, and around a fifth will be too severe. So basically, schools are more likely to be more lenient than more severe. So for that reason, those sorts of issues, new SLT, huge interventions, changes in curriculum, anything like that won't be counted in. It really depends on the weighting that's given. Maybe by this time next week, when we do this with Dylan, we might have a draft formula to look at, and we can see what that weighting will be. I think the chances are unlikely, but we might do. That at the moment, under the current proposals, there would be no way to appeal it on that basis.
Okay, just a couple more questions. Can we check if Ofqual will share baseline data for cohorts with each exam board?
I think that ties into the previous questions as well, around baseline data. Yeah.
Okay. And then exam boards are still allowing tier changes, but there have been rumours that this can't happen and they need to be ranked. Could you confirm that it's still okay to change tiers where appropriate following preliminary results, as would happen normally?
Yeah. So again, this is something we were talking to the exam boards about this week. Short answer is they don't know yet, so we don't know. Given the point about that exam boards will be able to accept late entries, I think I would expand that to say that it's likely that changes of tier will also be accepted. What we don't know yet is about how the ranking will work, whether you rank it within each tier or whether you do a whole ranking for that subject. And again, the exam boards aren't clear about that. So again, in those subjects where there are still tiered exams, what I'd probably be recommending the heads of those departments do is to think about it as one rank at the moment, because then if it does become a rank for the separate tiers, higher and foundation, it's probably easier to extrapolate it from the one rank than it is to then try and amalgamate it at the end. So probably go for the one rank at the moment, and then you can always go back and take it out.
Okay, so just a quick note, will the PowerPoint be available at the end? Will you share it?
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay, great. Do private entries, ex-students, for example, grades, do they need to be ranked with the current A-level students?
Yep, absolutely. So with the ranking, yep, any candidate that you're submitting as a centre, to use kind of Ofqual language, any candidate you're submitting as a centre, you need to rank for that subject, regardless of whether they're returning, private, what year group they're in. If they were due to sit the same exam, you rank them in that same rank.
Okay, and then final question, again, very similar. Students in vertical option groups, years 9, 10 and 11, do they rank each of the year groups separately or across the subject?
Across the subject, yeah. Any candidates in the summer 2020 series for each subject, you're ranking them, yeah. And
I think we're pretty much up to date now.
Great. Well, as I said, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Mike, for fielding those. If you do have any more questions, please be in touch with your RM. Please do be in touch with me. Again, we are really trying to work on your behalf as much as possible, and the more steer you give us about where we should be placing our energies, the better. So please do continue to let us know. Obviously, it's the 23rd of April, and I know many of you, if you were in schools normally this week and today, would have been celebrating St. George's Day and Shakespeare. So I'm just going to leave and say happy St. George's Day, happy Shakespeare Day. Thank you for your continued support of our young people. And I'm going to leave you with my favourite adaptation of a Shakespeare play. But have a good rest of the day. Have a great weekend when it comes around. Stay safe, stay healthy. Thank you.